I remember the way the building exhaled cold air when the doors opened, the way the lobby plants looked too glossy to have ever known sun, the way my own reflection hovered over the glass case with the company's awards like a second candidate still waiting to be chosen. Everything was curated to feel like the right decision. The front desk had a bowl of individually wrapped mints in a color that matched the logo. A small placard near the elevators described community initiatives and volunteer days, written in a tone that suggested moral gravity and breezy fun could coexist. It all had a cleanliness that was not just physical but ideological. Even the badges were minimalist, stamped with an optimistic tagline that felt less like a brand and more like a promise someone was daring me to test. I wanted to believe. It is strange now to realize how easily belief can be engineered with a tasteful font and a chilled lobby. I had told myself that a healthy culture would be obvious from the threshold, that I would sense it in the looseness of shoulders and the unstudied pace of footsteps. What I noticed instead was a softness in people's faces, the specific softness of someone performing ease. Eyes settled on screens with that intent calm that suggests a timetable hiding underneath the surface. The elevator chimed and I rode up, counting floors by the brief weightlessness that comes with mild acceleration, aware of my own pulse like a metronome guiding a song I hadn't learned. The orientation room was arranged like a gentle amphitheater. There were branded notebooks, refillable water bottles, and a slide on the large screen that said, "We belonged here." The words had a pleasant roundness, and the color gradient behind them looked like a lake at sunrise. I sat in the second row because I've never trusted the first row, and the last feels like a place for people who already know what they're doing. The others filtered in with backpacks and laptop sleeves. The room smelled faintly of new carpet and citrus cleaner. Someone had planned this scent. Someone had decided that success should smell like this. A facilitator moved at the front, and I took in facts the way one takes in the shape of a house by running a hand along the walls. There were policies that sounded humane, benefits that sounded thoughtful, and phrases that tapped insistently at a place in me that had been bruised by other places: psychological safety, work-life balance, radical candor, asynchronous trust. Slides drifted by like well-trained birds. I wrote a few things in the margin of my notebook for the feeling of it. In retrospect, the most important thing I wrote was a small square I drew around the word pulse. We would receive a weekly pulse survey, I learned, a quick check on how we were doing. 3 questions, sometimes 5. Anonymous, of course. The results would help leadership keep the culture strong. It was a tiny thing, a handful of seconds each week. It sounded benevolent, like a neighbor offering to water your plants. I traced the square around the word and moved on. After the overview, we were shown the floor, an open plan with quiet rooms scattered like islands, soft light that never flickered, and desks that rose and sank with a gentle motorized sigh. Framed on the central wall was a mural of phrases employees had contributed in a branding exercise. The phrases felt neutral but precise, as if someone had sanded away all the splinters of opinion and left only polished intention. I stood for a moment in front of the mural and tried to imagine the voices that had fed it. I caught my reflection again, the edges of my face blending with the typography. I remember thinking that if reflection had a brand guide, this would be it. My team sat in a corner nook where the carpet changed texture and color, demarcating a territory within a territory. Screens were angled at identical degrees. The chairs had that quiet firmness you notice because you're supposed to. A calendar link arrived with a tone I would come to know too well, a small bell inside my machine, a chime that pretended it was a suggestion. I accepted the meetings because that is what you do on your first day, and in a week you accept them because it feels rude not to. And by the end of the month, you accept them because it is easier than asking what would happen if you didn't. They showed me the dashboards. There is always a dashboard where you can watch your life become a set of indicators. Green meant I was aligned. Yellow was a caution that never sounded like a warning. Red was theoretical, a color reserved for outdated training slides, and the occasional cautionary tale told in performance-free terms. Each column had a title that was plainly worded and somehow obscure. Throughput, cycle confidence, initiative heat. None of these described people directly, which is probably why people began to describe themselves in these terms. It was a relief, at first, to have complexity pressed into charts I could scroll through. I told myself clarity was kindness. There was a room on our floor called the Serenity Room. It had a living wall, pale wood, slats, and a muted rug. The company guide suggested it for meditation, breathing, or to decompress between moments. It was never full, but it was never empty either. People went in alone and emerged a little smoother, as if a seam had been ironed flat. I went in once before lunch and sat in a chair angled toward nothing. There was a small fountain whose water made a domestic sound, like a sink left on a little too long in someone else's kitchen. I closed my eyes and listened to the room existing without me. When I opened them, the light had shifted just enough to make me wonder whether it had changed or I had. At my desk, I opened the welcome packet. Inside was a card that asked me to write a letter to myself, to be delivered in a year. It was framed as a practice in intention, a way to speak across time to the person you might be. I liked the idea, and I filled the page with earnestness that now makes me want to turn the card face down. I wrote about balance and boundaries, about wanting to be helpful but not replaceable, visible but not hyper-visible, steady without becoming static. I sealed the envelope, handed it to the office services desk, and felt good in the way one feels good after telling the future what it should do. In the first week, I noticed a pattern that didn't look like a pattern. People responded to messages with swiftness that felt like good manners, except the swiftness never relaxed. Late afternoon replies had the soft brightness of early morning. Weekends were quiet in public channels, but direct messages behaved like a second weather system. There were emoji reactions that served as currency, a constellation of small acknowledgements carried invisible weight. No one told me to keep up. The current simply moved, and my legs knew to paddle. When the first pulse survey arrived, I clicked through the questions and answered with honest cheer. I truly did feel welcomed. I truly did feel supported. I truly did want to believe. Names populated my calendar with recurring patterns. There were ceremonies and syncs, stand-ups and strategy reviews. The language was so normal, it was easy to forget that a recurring meeting is not a neutral structure. It is a commitment that extends beyond the hour it occupies. I felt smart in those rooms, competent in a way that satisfied something basic. The work itself was not cruel. It moved forward in manageable increments that added up. We celebrated visible outcomes and tucked the rest into the drawers of our project boards, where they hummed quietly behind nice icons. The first sign arrived not as a sign but as an absence. A colleague's photo disappeared from the org chart. The note that followed was practical and kind. People moved on, it said. We wish them well. The phrasing was clean, scrubbed of the particulars that make change messy. I had only just met this person and had nothing to attach to the news but the shape of their chair and the position of their monitor. I accepted the fact and returned to my tasks. Later that week, in the Serenity Room, I realized I had begun to fold absences into the definition of normal. The fountain sounded the same no matter who wasn't there. A month in, I began to wake before my alarm. The hour I woke at was not dramatic, it was polite. The kind of hour when bakers are already at work but the rest of the world still flatlines. I told myself it was the quiet I wanted, the sanctuary of a head start. In the dimness, I made coffee and opened my laptop to tidy small things that collected at the edges of days. None of this felt compulsory. That was the trick. The pressure, if I had been able to name it then, arrived as an invitation to be excellent. It was a tone so agreeable that declining felt like a misunderstanding rather than a choice. Around that time, the weekly pulse score for our group dipped. We didn't see individuals, only aggregates. A color shifted from soft green to a yellow that looked more like sunlight than caution. A slide at an all-hands meeting acknowledged the change, paired with bright encouragements. The message was not corrective, it was supportive. We would listen, adjust, and evolve. The words made a cushion under the numbers, and I stepped onto the cushion because that is what you do when a floor is laid out for you. I met the quiet room on the 9th floor by accident. It was not on the map. A corridor branched where I thought it ended, opening onto a smaller space with 2 chairs, a floor lamp, and a window that looked across the city at a rectangle of water. The chairs were set too far apart to be conversational. I stood there, holding a notebook, momentarily certain I had intruded on something that did not require privacy but still deserved it. I sat for a while and watched the sky move in discrete shades. The city below carried on with its million private metrics. A thought formed that I could not yet hold, that this place had been made as a humane gesture, and that humane gestures, at scale, can become part of the mechanism that wears people down. I left the room without writing it down. On my 90-day mark, an automated message congratulated me. The animation confetti looked like someone had studied joy and rendered it responsibly. I clicked through to my dashboard and saw the line graphs smoothing in ways that made management relaxed and me quietly proud. In the hall, the mural's words looked steadier than before, even though I knew I had simply memorized their order. The Serenity Room smelled faintly of a new diffuser oil. Somewhere, a decision had been made to swap one calm for another. That afternoon, the calendar tiles shifted. A colleague had been reassigned to a different initiative. The note was upbeat. Another disappeared entirely. The note was formatted the same as the first time, and again I encountered change as clean text without the hurt of edges. At my desk, I opened a file to document process improvements and realized I was writing sentences that sounded like a person describing a river only by the stones beneath it. I was avoiding the current. I was avoiding the feeling that the current was the real subject. The second pulse survey I took with more attention. I hovered over the satisfaction scale longer than necessary, thinking of the quiet room and the chairs too far apart, the fountain's domestic persistence, the badge's gentle beep at the turnstiles. I marked my answers with a kind of corrective optimism, as if I could steer the boat by leaning toward an ideal version of us. After I submitted, a screen thanked me and suggested a short breathing exercise. The video was well produced. For 30 seconds I followed a circle expanding and contracting until it ended and left me looking at myself in the black screen. Nothing had changed, except that I could now return to my tasks without the small resistance that had been forming. The season turned. The city outside remembered heat, then forgot it again. Inside, the air remained the same temperate promise. People wore sweaters on hot days and short sleeves on cold afternoons. I learned where the good, quiet rooms were and which elevators seized when too many people entered at once. I knew the good vending machine items, the times the stairwell was empty enough to climb without small talk, the meeting titles that masked decisions already made, the ones that genuinely pulled at the shape of our work. My badge wore in at the edges. The ink on my name softened. I liked the softening. It meant I belonged to something. There was a day, late in that first season, when the line on our team's morale trend recovered. The color returned to the green. That means we can stop talking about it for a while. We did stop. That was the sign I missed. Relief accepted too easily becomes a habit, and habits have a way of rebranding erosion into routine. On my way out that evening, I stepped into the 9th floor room and stood by the window. Down in the street, a delivery truck idled beside a pile of empty pallets. The driver adjusted his cap and looked at nothing in particular. The building's glass reflected the last of the day in measured rectangles. I tried to picture my letter waiting somewhere in a drawer. It would arrive to me in a few months, full of promises I had no trouble believing when I wrote them. I left the building and the city air felt less manufactured. A bus hissed, a cyclist cut a neat arc around a pothole. Someone laughed from a doorway with the uncurated amplitude of a person who had not been taught to compress reaction into icons. I felt the relief of being outside and the pull to go back inside as soon as morning made it respectable. I told myself it was because the work mattered and the people were kind and the culture was good. All of that was true. It is also true that I had begun to accept a shape without asking who had drawn it. If I had kept a record that first quarter, it would have contained no single event that could be called the start of a break. It would look like a ledger of pleasant days layered with responsible effort and the occasional absence explained with professional courtesy. The first fracture was quieter than a whisper. It sounded like a survey ping that you answer on autopilot. It felt like a chair angled at nothing in particular. It looked like relief when a color shifted back to green. Later, I would learn to listen differently. But not yet. Not then. Then, the building breathed cold air into the lobby each morning, and I breathed it in, and somewhere behind all the curated ease, something small began to erode in a way no one could see, least of all me. It began in the kind of week that never announces itself. The calendar looked ordinary, a surface of familiar tiles with their discreet promises. The weather held to a mildness that could not be blamed for anything. The coffee machines worked. The escalators did not stutter. The city kept its end of the bargain by being predictably impatient outside, while the building remained a climate-controlled thought experiment within. There was nothing in the air that suggested a lesson was approaching. That was part of the lesson. A quarterly planning cycle came due, and with it, the tidy choreography we had rehearsed enough times to mistake it for spontaneity. Preparation had a taste by then, a mental aftertaste of frameworks and the pleasing geometry of slides stacked in logical towers. I trimmed the edges of my work the way one would neaten a hedge, removing stray growth to maintain the silhouette. The dashboards lifted their chins as expected. The aggregate morale stayed green. The pulse survey pinged, and I answered in a tone that could be mistaken for gratitude if one didn't look too closely. I didn't look too closely. On the second day of that week, an anonymous comment appeared at the bottom of a roll-up report. Anonymous comments were not unusual. The system encouraged them with soft fonts and gentle language about psychological safety. Most of them read like breath on glass, visible for a moment, gone when the room's temperature evened out. This one lingered. It said, in the stripped syntax of a person writing quickly and editing past their own discomfort, that the work felt like a race with no finish line, that rest was permitted only in the margins and even then measured, that the kindness of the culture acted like a sedative against the simple recognition of exhaustion. It ended with a sentence that refused to tidy itself, that the pressure lived in the spaces between our agreements, not in the agreements themselves. The comment sat there beneath the approved data like an uninvited object on a polished shelf. I read it twice, then a third time, then pretended I hadn't. The report closed with a quiet click, and I moved on to something that had a numeric answer. The mind knows how to keep the day moving. The body follows, because routine is the oldest agreement. Later, in the hallway where the mural's phrases had been engineered to sound like everyone's voice and no one's burden, I felt a slow recognition arrive in the least dramatic way possible. The anonymous note had given shape to a feeling I had been hosting without language. It was as if someone had traced a finger along a hairline crack I had walked past for weeks, the same way one walks past a mirror that has begun to separate from the wall by the thickness of a coin. Once seen, it could not be unseen. Once named, it made a quiet sound in everything. Still, the day required its motions, and I honored them. A review meeting advanced through its respectful agenda. A set of charts advanced through their rightful sequence. The afternoon collected small tasks the way a pocket collects lint. I visited the Serenity Room and listened to water suggest the idea of water. The fountain's persistence had begun to feel like a metronome set by someone who believed rhythm alone could be a cure. In the middle of that unremarkable afternoon, the building conducted one of those unintentional experiments that reveal more than any designed survey. The corporate network paused. Not down, not broken, paused, like a held breath. Tabs tried to refresh and held their place. Chat indicators became small gray ghosts. Calendars turned into indistinct abstractions of rectangles that forgot what they had promised. It lasted fewer than 10 minutes, a minor interruption by any operational measure, the way a single missed heartbeat would be meaningless if there weren't a body attached. The pause did something to the floor. It removed the hum that hides inside work when work is mediated by machines. The room sounded like air and fabric and the domestic noises of bodies in chairs. I heard the subtle creak of a posture adjusting 2 desks away. I heard someone's pen hesitate then continue because the hand did not require confirmation from a server to complete a loop of ink. I heard, from the quiet room I hadn't intended to notice, the faintest exhale, the kind that carries a private inventory. The pause revealed how much of our motion had been keyed to the chime of incoming commitments. Without the chime, the shape of the day showed itself like a negative. When the network resumed, the floor snapped back into synchrony so quickly it felt like waking from a dream you are glad to leave and oddly sorry to lose. The alerts arrived in a compressed cascade. Messages caught up with themselves. A small apology banner appeared at the top of an internal page and then slid away, satisfied with its own sufficient politeness. I watched the people near me lean forward half an inch as if to make up for the delay with a gesture the body understood before the mind agreed. The snapback was almost elegant. It was also a kind of confession. At home that evening, I booked time on my calendar for the following mornings. The event titles were devoted to focus, framed as a promise to myself to claim uninterrupted thought. The appointments began at an hour that still felt like dawn, even in a city that never insists on silence. The first morning I kept the appointment with the kind of eagerness that makes a new habit feel like a small achievement. The second morning I kept it with relief. The third morning I kept it because it had been written down. By the end of the week, the new hour felt like an ethical choice, as if the day would waste me if I did not get ahead of it. The crack had widened a fraction. It still was not visible from across the room. The letter I had written to myself arrived early, perhaps because the internal mail system is more efficient for symbols than for packages. The envelope had a printed note on the outside that congratulated me for investing in my own growth. I sat in the 9th floor room and opened it with the care one reserves for something that might be sentimental even if it shouldn't be. The handwriting was my own, which is to say it was both familiar and embarrassing. The sentences were earnest and uncontroversial. They asked me to protect a softness I had not protected and to honor boundaries I had allowed to move the way sand moves underwater slowly, imperceptibly, inevitably. I felt the uncomfortable sensation of being urged by a past version of myself to do what the present version had already negotiated away. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it under the chair. There is a strange relief in leaving a message to yourself in a room designed for silence. It felt like handing an object back to the building and asking it to keep it safe until I could. A colleague's absence returned as a presence. Not the colleague themselves, not their voice or their chair or the way they capped their pen, just the shape of what used to be where they had been. The shape took the form of a new recurring task that appeared on my board without fanfare, the way the weather can change without feeling like a change. The assignment fit neatly against my existing responsibilities, as if the edges had been measured and machined to press perfectly against each other. I took it because it belonged somewhere, and the quickest way to remove the noise of an unowned thing is to own it. I told myself it was temporary, the way one tells oneself that winter is temporary when the first frost appears on the railing. The crack made its second sound at a town hall meeting staged with the warmth the company was sincerely good at producing. The executive cadence was something I had grown accustomed to. Humility without self-erasure, confidence without swagger, the hard metrics and the soft ones braided together into a story about direction. At the end, a slide appeared that summarized the past quarter's engagement findings. The colors were pleasing, the numbers did not frighten anyone. In the space where open Q&A was encouraged through the safe veil of digital submission, a sentence surfaced that looked as if it could have been written by the same hand that had left the anonymous comment beneath the roll-up report. It said the culture was kind and the pace was corrosive. It said people were smiling with their teeth and sleeping with their laptops powered on because if they did not, the current would carry them to a place where opportunities were discussed in the past tense. It did not accuse. It described. The moderator thanked the person for their courage. The executive team thanked the moderator for reminding everyone that honesty was a cornerstone of trust. The response was correct in every way. A task force would study workload, working groups would meet, best practices would be shared. The words came out like a blanket, and a blanket does what a blanket does. It warms and it also muffles. In the chat ticker, small hearts and thumbs traveled in an agreeable stream. I watched them as if they were paper boats set down in a river that was not designed to be altered by paper. After the meeting, the floor felt brighter in that way a space can feel bright when the lights have not actually changed. People moved with a renewed correctness, as if to prove that the system could metabolize honesty without indigestion. I completed a set of tasks with crisp satisfaction and told myself that adaptation was happening in places I could not see. Perhaps it was. The crack did not care. It continued its quiet work, and because I did not speak to it in words, it spoke to me in arrangements. The third sound came from a calendar shift I would not have noticed in the past. A recurring meeting moved 15 minutes earlier across the week. The 15 minutes took something no one named. They took the margin where a person might stand up, fill a glass, look out of a window, and let their eyes disagree with their screen. They took the time needed to say no to another small meeting without sounding unhelpful. They took the padding between a decision and its rehearsal. The invitation language described the change as minor. The effect registered in the nervous system, the way a slightly too tight sleeve registers when you are polite enough not to adjust it in public. At home, I began to experience an unfamiliar fatigue that did not announce itself with drama. It presented as a delay between intention and motion, like the extra half second before standing that belongs to people who have learned their furniture too well. I found myself inspecting the edges of my habits the way one inspects a countertop for hairline scratches that won't be visible to guests. There were no clear indicators to blame. My metrics remained favorable. My manager, whose humanity I respected, continued to extend the right sentences at the right times. The work shipped, the numbers behaved, praise arrived in brief, caloric bursts. The crack widened anyway. It had found a path through the structure that did not require permission. A Friday concluded with a small celebration for a release that had refused to be easy and finally decided to be complete. Cups lifted. The office playlist performed the acceptable range of enthusiasm. In the collapse that follows a sprint, a collective stillness settled, the way a theater feels just after the applause when people are deciding whether to leave or pretend they live there. I stood by the window and looked at the city staging its own rituals of closure and continuation. The building across the street switched a set of lights off floor by floor with the discipline of a machine that had taught itself manners. Our floor remained evenly lit because a central brain believed in consistency. Standing there, I felt a notion circle, something it had been unable to approach all week. The idea was not complicated. It said that a culture can be kind and still carve people down to the thickness of their usefulness. That systems built to care can become instruments of pressure precisely because they reduce friction and mask the heat of contact. That I had mistaken the absence of cruelty for the presence of health. The recognition did not bring relief. It brought accuracy. Accuracy is rarely comfortable at first pass. It asks the body to adjust to a heavier truth. I went to the 9th floor room and sat in the chair that points to nothing in particular and everything at once. The sun had moved far enough to turn the water into a sheet of hammered metal. I had no plan. Plans belong to days with answers. What I had was a slow willingness to inventory the cost of an arrangement I had accepted because it looked like care. I watched the city, which has never promised care, and has never pretended to proceed with its noise and light. I sat long enough to feel the chair admit my shape. When I finally stood, the shape remained for a moment, an indentation that would rise back to level as if no one had been there. The week ended, as weeks insist on doing. The metrics were updated, the dashboards refreshed. The mural did not change its words. My badge worked at the turnstile with the same soft beep that had once felt like entrance and now felt like agreement. The crack had not broken anything. That is the trouble with hairline fractures. They live with the structure. They are invisible to casual inspection. They do their work in quiet. They wait. I slept through my alarm on Saturday. The body is better at honesty than mind or culture or metrics. It took the time it needed and presented me with a morning that had no schedule on it. I drank coffee slowly, without the performance of productivity, and noticed the absence of the hum I had taught myself to want. The quiet did not cheer. It made room. In that room, a sentence completed itself without resistance. I was not being asked to sprint. I was being trained to never stop running. The recognition did not break anything either. It simply handed me a language I could carry back into the building on Monday, a lens I could place between my eye and the pleasant surfaces. The first hairline crack had announced itself. The next chapter would be about the ways a structure responds when you start tracing the fissures instead of polishing around them. There is a stage in slow degradation where nothing feels wrong because nothing feels surprising. The mind rearranges the furniture inside itself so the room looks the same, even when the walls have inched closer. The next quarter unfolded that way, not as collapse, but as equilibrium between fatigue and function. No one asked for more hours. No one refused fewer. The boundaries simply redrew themselves in the space between tasks. You can adapt to anything if the change is slow enough. The mornings I once claimed as sanctuary began to feel like compressed time, a private window where I could move through a backlog before the collective grid woke up. It became a ritual. Waking before the light had a certain nobility to it, or at least a defensible logic. When the calendar pinged at 9, I already had 2 hours behind me, and there was a calm pride in that head start. But pride is a fuel with an aftertaste. What once felt like agency became maintenance. In those weeks, the pulse surveys were almost rhythmic. The responses became practiced an instinct to balance mild honesty with vague optimism. A gentle rating of mostly satisfied has the same shape as please don't probe this too hard. We all understood that. The organization released an internal article celebrating resilience. It featured anonymized tips from anonymous contributors, small systems they used to stay centered, intentional, committed. The tone was aspirational. The examples were elegant. Morning journaling before email, midday walks for clarity, hydration as self-respect, the art of invisible prioritization. It all read like wisdom extracted from lives that never got messy. Reading it felt like reading advice from people who had never needed advice. The rationale underneath was obvious. If you can treat endurance as insight, you never have to examine the thing you are enduring. A different type of absence began to appear. Then not the sudden removal of a person from the org chart, but the gradual fading of someone's presence. An avatar still responded, tasks still completed, but the tone of their contribution thinned out. The bright edges around their sentences dimmed. They began to resemble someone narrating their own involvement from a few steps behind their own body. Nobody discussed it, but everyone noticed. Every system has ghosts before it has vacancies. Looking back, I understand that an organization can metabolize human erosion with the same efficiency it uses to metabolize new features, design upgrades, or process improvements. Decline has throughput. Withdrawal has velocity. A human being can disappear without leaving a technical anomaly. At the time, I didn't have that language. I only had the pattern recognition of someone whose nervous system was becoming a better witness than his conscious mind. Sometimes I sat in the serenity room just to understand what my own breathing sounded like when there wasn't a task waiting inside the next second. And sometimes the sound of that breathing felt like proof that I still existed independent of the dashboard where my output could be graphed. Small rituals began to appear around the floor, quiet markers of mutual exhaustion that never needed to be named. People began carrying larger water bottles. People switched their camera off in meetings under the guise of focus. Some calendars began to include cryptic personal block segments that migrated slightly each day, like a window being slid along a track. No one questioned these shifts. Adaptation was considered maturity. And maturity, in that environment, was indistinguishable from compliance. I didn't break. I didn't fall apart. That is not how this kind of damage works. It was more like a tightening, subtle, incremental, cumulative. My brain felt like a muscle permanently mid-flex. Not painful, just never relaxed. The crack that had been hairline became structural, not because it spread dramatically, but because it became the default geometry of things. There was no trauma moment, just the quiet realization that the version of myself who had walked in on day one, the person who wrote that letter with conviction, had become someone I referenced instead of inhabited. The old me had been a witness. The new me was a mechanism. And the system rewarded mechanisms. That was the problem. The problem was how good I had become at running on smooth surfaces, and how little friction remained to tell me when I had gone too far. What I didn't see then but can see now, with almost painful clarity, is that systems like this don't push you hard. They invite you deeper. Burnout doesn't announce itself as a red siren. It comes disguised as opportunity. Every time someone quietly disappeared, their work didn't vanish with them. It redistributed itself among the ones who were still handling it well. And in corporate language, handling it well usually means failing silently. Silence is the most valuable currency inside a high-performing organization. The people who said nothing were rewarded not explicitly, not with emails or public praise, but with more visibility, more trust, more responsibility. The system pushes its weight onto the ones who don't resist. And they don't resist because they believe that endurance is a form of professionalism. I know this now because I became one of those people. Not by ambition, by inertia. You don't need to reach for more when more keeps reaching for you. I remember the way the dashboards began to show a new column, initiative responsiveness, a new metric, innocent at face value. Just a measurement of how quickly someone reacted to new tasks being assigned. I scored high without trying, because I responded even during the hours that technically belonged to no one. There is no victory in winning a race no one else entered. The thing that haunted me later wasn't the workload, it was how naturally my body accepted the sensation of always being slightly behind, always needing to lean forward another degree. You can sustain anything if you never stop long enough to measure what the sustainment costs. In that quarter, I became the person others came to with small asks, because I had the reputation of getting things done. And the mistake I made, the one that sealed the next stage of erosion, was that I kept saying yes to protect the image of someone who had it together. People don't burn out because they're weak. They burn out because they're strong enough to keep going long after the point where most would stop. The Serenity Room ironically became the place where I realized I no longer entered to rest. I entered to rehearse functionality. I sat in those chairs not to decompress, but to recharge just enough to go back and stay consistent. I wasn't using support. I was using coping. There's a difference. The corporate system didn't ask me to give more. It simply never gave me a moment where giving less felt allowed. That's how invisible pressure works. Nobody tells you to speed up. They simply remove every condition in which slowing down is thinkable. Looking back, the real turning point wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a blow-up or a confrontation or a collapse. It was a Tuesday afternoon where I realized something I could not unlearn. I could no longer tell whether I was choosing this or simply unable to step outside of it. And when you lose the sense of choosing, that is the true beginning of ending. The next shift didn't begin in thought. It began in physiology. It was small, subtle, barely worth noting at the time, but it was the first signal that something inside me had begun its own separate logic, one that didn't care about deliverables or dashboards or culture slides, one that didn't negotiate. It started in the mornings. Not exhaustion, that word is too dramatic, too cinematic, too conveniently recognizable. It was delay. A half-second pause before standing up from bed. A moment of stillness before opening the laptop. A tiny, almost imperceptible lag between intention and motion. Nothing alarming, just resistance without reason. A sensation like the body wasn't refusing, it just wasn't cooperating at the same pace, as if I had to convince it to move. I remember one morning particularly clearly, not because it was extreme, but because it was ordinary. Those are the dangerous ones. I sat at the kitchen table with my hand resting on the trackpad of the laptop, and despite knowing exactly what I needed to do next, I didn't click. Not avoidance, not fear, just stillness. A stillness that wasn't rest. A stillness that felt like the body saying, I already know what this day will feel like. And for a few seconds, nothing in me argued. There was also a new pattern in the evenings. It wasn't insomnia. It was thinking after everything was done, but not in the sense of reflection, more like looping, computational residue. Thoughts repeating because they had velocity they didn't know how to dissipate. Work thoughts with no content, only momentum. I would sit on the couch long after closing my laptop, and the mind would keep searching for the next step, even though the day was already over. No narrative, no problem to solve. Just a hum like a machine in standby mode. A baseline tension in the chest that wasn't panic and wasn't fear. A sensation closer to the faint hum of a neon light in an empty room. Not harmful, just present, always present. And my mind, trained by the corporate logic that efficiency equals virtue, tried to optimize even that. I began to experiment with micro-adjustments. A different morning beverage, a slower evening routine, a new productivity app, rearranging my workspace house, scheduling deeper breaks between calls. Each adjustment worked for exactly one day. Then the same internal delay returned like a software patch that had no effect on the underlying hardware. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. It wasn't the tasks that were heavy. It was the weight of constant readiness. Performance wasn't the problem. The problem was the permanently engaged state. I lived in a posture of slightly on, even in rest, even in silence, even in sleep. It wasn't tension, it was anticipation, a readiness with no defined trigger, a readiness that had become identity. That's when I saw the second truth clearly, though I didn't say it aloud at the time. My nervous system had adjusted faster than my awareness. And when the body adapts faster than the mind, the collapse, when it comes, doesn't feel like breaking. It feels like relief. I wasn't there yet, but I was moving, quietly, mechanically, consistently, toward the point where relief would look suspiciously similar to surrender. Corporate systems do not reinforce burnout with punishment. They reinforce it with small rewards. Not money, not promotion, not status symbols you could photograph. The rewards are more subtle, more dangerous, and more addictive. They come in the form of being asked your opinion first, being included in early phase conversations, being forwarded confidential previews, being trusted with ambiguity, being told, we knew you could handle this. These don't feel like pressure. They feel like recognition. Recognition is the most potent drug in high-functioning corporate environments because it doesn't arrive as ego inflation. It arrives as meaning. Meaning is harder to step away from than money. Around that period, I began to get special asks. Not the kind that show up in calendars. the kind that manifest in low-key invitations from senior leadership disguised as curiosity. What's your take on this? How would you frame that? Can you look at this before we socialize it? Except, those were not asks. They were recruitments, a gentle absorption of my judgment into the machinery of the narrative. My thinking started to be pre-distilled before decisions were shared publicly. This is the purest form of psychological reinforcement. You begin to feel like a critical part of the organism, not in egoistic terms. In structural terms, the organism wants you inside it in its bloodstream, not just in its limbs. So your nervous system learns a new equation: participation identity, identity significance, significance temporary relief. And just like that, the cycle becomes self-perpetuating. You don't stay because you fear leaving. You stay because stepping back feels like dissolving a part of yourself. At that stage, I began to receive small acknowledgements, the corporate equivalent of breadcrumbs validating performance. A brief slide credit in an exec deck, being referenced by initial rather than full name. Everyone knows who that is. Asynchronous alignment docs tagged to my board without explanation, being copied on threads that were slightly above my pay grade. None of these were big things. That is what made them powerful. Big promotions raise suspicion inside yourself first. Small identity rewards bypass all rational defense. They make you feel seen, not praised, not flattered, integrated. That is the lethal twist. Integration masquerades as belonging. The system didn't elevate me. It absorbed me. And like any organism, it did it slowly, efficiently, painlessly. I didn't notice when the line between "I work here" and "I am this" blurred, because it didn't blur in my mind. It blurred in my nervous system. And the moment identity fuses with performance, the self no longer has a boundary. You don't guard yourself anymore. You utilize yourself. And the company doesn't need to coerce that. It only needs to not interrupt it. The next shift was not cognitive. It was chemical. There comes a stage in long-term pressure where the body, not the mind, becomes addicted to the sensation of being slightly on. Not because it feels good, but because the absence of that sensation feels unfamiliar. This is where microdopamine enters. Not the loud version, not accomplishment, not celebration, not milestones. The quiet version, the tiny spikes. The reward of checking just one more thing. Not to finish something, but to relieve the tension of not checking. That's the subtle mechanism. At first, you work to get things done. Then you begin working to reduce the discomfort of not working. It isn't ambition, it's withdrawal management. That is the moment the nervous system becomes a loop, constantly seeking the next micro-interaction so that it doesn't have to sit in a space without stimulus. I started to notice this in the spaces between my days. In elevators, waiting for the kettle, waiting for a download bar, pauses between sentences in meetings, even walking from one room to another. These were once neutral pockets of existence, human moments. Now they became opportunities to relieve the friction of stillness by briefly checking the inbox, the board, a thread, a notification page, a metric trend. Nobody asked me to do this, but the system didn't discourage it. And that's the thing. You do not need corporate coercion when the reward circuitry has been hijacked by self-generated anticipation. You become your own supervisor. The smallest ping became a chemical cue, not because the ping had meaning, but because the body wanted the release of certainty. Knowing where things are becomes its own drug. This is how subtle the trap becomes. You no longer work to be productive. You work to avoid the micro-discomfort of not knowing. And so you open the laptop at night, not because it's necessary, but because there's a static hum inside you that can only be silenced by clearing the tiny things. The tragic part? This is the exact stage where outsiders look at you and think, wow, this person is extremely disciplined. Because from the outside, it does look like discipline. Waking early, high responsiveness, always aware, always on top of things. But from the inside, it's not discipline. It's a self-reinforcing anxious loop that is too subtle to call anxiety, yet a loop whose absence feels like void. A loop that makes stillness feel like malfunction. The body had learned something the mind still denied. Dopamine was no longer tied to achievement, it was tied to participation, not progress, presence. And as long as the system continued giving me small, digestible signals that I was integral, I didn't have to face the fact that I had stopped being a participant in my own life. I had become a node, reliable, efficient, predictable, invisible to myself, but highly valuable to the machine. There wasn't a single day when after work vanished. It dissolved the way shoreline dissolves a grain at a time until the coastline no longer remembers where it used to be. The most dangerous erosion is the one that feels rational. That's how it started. Not by extending hours, by shrinking transitions. 5 minutes before dinner, let me just reply to this one thing. 10 minutes after a walk, I'll just check the board so tomorrow feels smoother. A small glance before sleep, I want to start the morning clean. Every intrusion made sense. None of them were dramatic. That is how the boundary eroded. Micro-justifications. Work never demanded more time, it simply asked for continuity. You start answering messages at odd hours, not because you're pressured, but because you feel time's incomplete times when you don't. Evenings became porous. Weekends became extensions of weekdays. Holidays became asynchronous maintenance windows. The most profound shift was not in time but in posture. I began to move through non-work time with a slight forward lean, a subtle internal tilt toward the next task. Even in a grocery store, my attention felt partially tethered to the work grid, as if my mind was always half inhabiting a digital room somewhere. When I sat at dinner, I wasn't fully there. Presence became a currency I spent in thin slices. There was no sadness, no resentment, no anxiety I could name. Just a sense that the day never ended, it simply dimmed. Even in silence, the system was open in the background, like an app you never bother to close because reopening it takes energy. I noticed this especially in how I consumed free hours. I no longer entered them. I only passed through them, waiting for the next moment when being productive again would feel justified. Then something else began. The nervous system started to crave not rest but the predictability of the work rhythm. Free time, instead of feeling like freedom, began to feel like uncertainty. Uncertainty is exhausting. Work, ironically, became the easier space. Because work had structure, life outside work did not. This is how a system captures a person without coercion. It makes the non-system feel like friction. It makes the system feel like alignment. Eventually, you stop choosing. Not because you can't stop, but because stopping feels like chaos. And so evenings become buffer zones. Weekends become light administrative review. Vacations become maintenance on low power mode. Not because anyone requested it, because your identity is now wired to participation. This was the period where I realized quietly, without drama, that I had stopped belonging to my own time. Time had become shared property. My nervous system was co-owned, and no one had taken it from me. I had volunteered. There comes a stage where life doesn't disappear, it just becomes justified. Everything you do outside of work starts to be evaluated with a silent filter. Does this make me better at my job or not? This filter arrives quietly. It doesn't feel imposed. It feels like efficiency. I didn't stop having interests. They just slowly stopped being for themselves. Reading a book became an investment in strategic thinking. Walks became mental clarity sessions. Podcasts became skill stacking. Even resting became energy optimization. Nothing was pure anymore. Everything had a purpose. Even joy became transactional. People usually think burnout feels like collapse. In truth, the first real symptom is instrumentalization of pleasure. If something didn't feed back into the performance loop, it felt wasteful. I would find myself skipping parts of movies because the pacing wasn't efficient. I would choose meals based on whether they kept me sharp, not whether they satisfied anything human in me. Conversations with friends shrank not because they weren't important, but because small talk didn't map to improvement. Improvement had become a religion, a silent, rational one, but a religion nonetheless. And corporate systems reward this because they do not measure how alive a person is, only how lubricated their mental machinery feels. The internal newsletters began to share employee spotlights. People who balanced marathon training with major product launches. People who did yoga at 5 a.m. and answered strategy comments by 9:30. People who took Saturday courses in leadership psychology. They looked like high-functioning adults. But there was something missing in their eyes, a flatness disguised as focus. I didn't realize then that these spotlights were mirrors. They were showing me the version of myself the system was slowly sculpting. It wasn't dystopian. It was polite. It was aspirational. It told you, you can be more, you should be more. You are not done becoming. And this is where the trick lies. When becoming becomes permanent, being becomes impossible. That's when the inner landscape shifts in a nearly invisible way, a way I wouldn't have recognized if someone asked me directly. The present tense stops being a place you live in and becomes only a transit point toward future utility. Pleasure loses edges. Joy loses spontaneity. Rest loses softness. Everything is partial. Everything is postponed. Everything is a means. It's not that life becomes empty. It becomes conditional. And when the present is conditional, you can never fully arrive in it. Even in the rare seconds where some impulse of old humanity broke through a moment of laughter, a second of silence, a pulse of genuine wonder, I would feel the aftertaste of, that was nice, but now back to it. The worst part was how reasonable it all felt. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't depressed. I wasn't panicked. I was simply optimized. Optimized so gradually that I didn't notice the trade. The less human I became, the more functional the system found me. And that felt like a compliment. In 104, there is a specific phase, a strange plateau where the system stops feeling heavy. Not because you recovered, but because you adapted. This is the stage that looks, from the outside, like peak functioning. Everything fits. Everything flows. Everything feels normal. And that is the most dangerous moment, because it becomes impossible to tell where you end and the system begins. I remember realizing this on a random weekday, a day without incident, without conflict, without overload. A day that behaved exactly the way the employee playbook would want a day to behave. A good day. Tasks flowed one into another effortlessly. Meetings aligned without friction. Decisions arrived without emotional resistance. I was calm, precise, consistent. In the absence of any tension, a small panic began to pulse, but not in the heart, in the identity. Not a panic of fear, a panic of recognition. This isn't resilience. This is conditioning. It felt like waking up in the middle of a conversation I had been having for months, only to notice I no longer knew which parts of the voice belonged to me. The system had become my default mental language. I noticed it in how I framed personal things. Sleeping was recharging the architecture. Eating was fueling cognitive stability. Exercise was stress disposal optimization. Conversations were alignment of emotional bandwidth. Choices were priority stack ranking. Not because anyone taught me to say those phrases, but because I had internalized the grammar of utility. Everything was feedback. Everything was throughput. Everything was discrete value. Even thoughts, even emotions, especially emotions. There was a moment that made this unmistakable so quiet that I almost missed it. I was walking into the bathroom at home and caught my reflection in the mirror, not in any dramatic, cinematic way, just the ordinary kind, the kind that shows you're alive but not how much. And I realized something simple and terrifying in its simplicity. I hadn't been thinking in first person for a long time. My internal voice had shifted into a neutral, objective narrator, the same tone I used when documenting systems, observations, outcomes. There was no "I feel." Only "this is the state." I had become a report about myself, a passive observer of my own mind, describing my internal terrain the way one might label fields on a satellite map. The self had been replaced by telemetry. And here's the part that made it so insidious. Nothing hurt. It didn't feel wrong. It felt efficient. The soft panic came from the fact that efficiency, when totalized, leaves nowhere to rest, not even inside yourself. In those days, everything around me was fine. Metrics were good, feedback was positive, trust was high. My mental state wasn't unstable, it was neutral to the point of translucence. That neutrality, that seamless functioning, had become my personality. I wasn't numb. Numbness implies pain avoidance. I was streamlined, optimized. I had crossed the threshold from performer to instrument. And because instruments don't feel pressure, only calibration, I no longer felt the need to question anything. No conflict, no resistance, no friction, only the thin, weightless hum of constant normality. That hum became the background of my life. And the horror of that hum, if you want to call it horror, wasn't that it was overwhelming. The horror was that it made everything else feel unnecessary. The system didn't need to break me. It only needed to convince me that nothing outside of it was essential. And at that point, it had succeeded. The next deterioration didn't happen in the office. It happened in the space where the office wasn't present. Relationships slowly lost resolution. Not abruptly, not violently, just subtly. People in my life began to feel like interruptions. Not because they were demanding, not because they were unkind, but because human interaction has no KPI, no structure, no defined throughput. Conversations began to feel inefficient. Not annoying, inefficient. I noticed it first in the way I responded to messages. Not ignoring, just delaying. Because responding would require entering a non-performative context, where nothing was being advanced in any measurable sense. Phone calls felt overwhelming, not emotionally but cognitively, like a tab that would require context switching away from the predictable internal environment I lived in. I stopped initiating plans, not out of depression, out of prioritization. If I spent 2 hours with someone, I could feel the internal reflex asking, "What have you moved forward? What have you clarified? What have you optimized?" There was no malice in this. But the internal infrastructure of my mind no longer treated human presence as nourishment, it treated it as friction. Even affection began to feel like latency. It was never conscious. It was never hostile. It was simply the logical extension of a self that had become instrumented. At gatherings, birthdays, dinners, small reunions, I began to stand slightly outside the gravitational pull of the room. Not physically, mentally. There was a moment, small, forgettable, when a friend was telling me about something painful in their life, something real, something meaningful, and I caught myself listening the same way I listened in retroactive project evaluations, waiting for the moment where there would be a strategic conclusion, some kind of takeaway, some actionable insight. But their pain wasn't a task. It was just pain, and I couldn't fully enter it. Not because I didn't care, but because my emotional processing unit had become specialized, tuned to performance contexts, tuned to optimization. Human connection is not a process. It's a presence. And presence in my new internal architecture was a luxury with no immediate ROI. So relationships didn't break. They faded. People didn't get pushed out. They were simply no longer prioritized. And the worst part, the most revealing part, was this: I didn't miss them. Not because they weren't meaningful, but because my sense of meaning had been trained to operate only inside the system that rewarded me. Everything outside the corporate organism had been quietly categorized as optional. And optional things are the first to disappear. No one complained. People just stopped expecting me to show up. And I, without admitting it, started to feel relieved that they didn't. Not because I didn't love them, but because I now lived in a world where love without utility registered as noise in the signal. That was the moment where emotional life didn't vanish. It became a background process, running silently, underutilized, non-blocking. And that non-blocking state, that quiet disengagement, shifted the foundation of who I was. Not dramatically, not tragically, just logically. The corporate organism had achieved full integration. My humanity was no longer gone. It had simply been minimized to the background, like an app you never close, but rarely open. There is a specific moment in this trajectory where you stop suffering from the erosion and begin participating in it consciously, but with a calm, almost elegant justification. Not denial, not confusion, not desperation. A rational self-betrayal. You know something is off, and you choose it anyway, because choosing anything else would destabilize the structure that currently feels like the only place where your identity still has clarity. That's the stage I entered next. It didn't look like tragedy. It looked like maturity. I told myself, this is just who I am now. Not with sadness, but with logic. I eliminated certain hobbies because they were no longer aligned with who I've become. I scaled down social commitments because they were not in this season's priorities. I trimmed the distractions, not out of pressure, but out of preference. In the language of optimization, this sounded admirable. From a distance, it looked like discipline. Up close, it was resignation disguised as evolution. It was astonishing how easy it was to convert slow collapse into intentional adulthood. Everything could be framed as growth. Losing interest in reading fiction? A sign of intellectual refinement. Avoiding long conversations? Boundary setting? Preferring asynchronous interactions? A sign of high cognitive economy. Reducing emotional investment? Preserving decision-making bandwidth. If someone had described these shifts to me from the outside, I would have recognized them as the early vectors of burnout. But from the inside, they felt like rational updates to an internal operating system. The brain loves self-consistency more than it loves truth. So once the identity had aligned with the system, every adjustment that harmed the self could be interpreted as an upgrade. In the same period, the company launched a new initiative around deep effectiveness. It used phrasing that echoed my internal choices almost perfectly, like the culture and my identity had co-written the same narrative. I remember reading the internal announcement and feeling understood. That was the most dangerous part. I felt seen. My self-betrayal was now reflected back to me as cultural alignment. And that feedback loop, the mutual reinforcement of personal erosion and organizational validation, created a powerful sense of correctness. It's easy to walk away from a system that hurts you openly. It's nearly impossible to walk away from a system that hurts you silently, but praises you for adapting well. In those weeks, I experienced a profound shift. I no longer needed external reward. I had internalized the system's logic so deeply that my self-valuation ran on the same code. I didn't need approval. I pre-approved myself according to its metrics. This was not pain. This was not despair. This was a seamless merger of identity with environment, a perfectly rational self-betrayal. Not because I was trying to deceive myself, but because there was nothing left inside me to object. The opposition had been optimized out. In traditional stories, destruction is dramatic. But in this kind of story, the kind that happens quietly, in bright offices and ergonomic chairs, destruction is polite. It holds the door for you. It smiles. It waits for you to choose it. At this stage, my life had become a seamless stream, not of tasks, but of readiness for tasks. I lived inside an always-on posture, the sense that if something needed to be done, I would be there to do it. I wasn't pressured. I wasn't coerced. I was simply available. That availability felt, at first, like pride. Later, like inevitability. I began to notice that my inner world no longer oscillated between on and off. It was just permanently standby. A low-humming state, neither stressed nor relaxed, just perpetually oriented toward the next action. And there was no moment, no calendar event, no message, no metric that ever told me, stop, nothing more is needed. You can rest now. The machine never declares the work complete because the machine doesn't believe in completion. Completion is a human concept. Machines operate on throughput until they break. And I at this stage had become more machine than human in my rhythms. I wasn't forced into over-functioning. I drifted into it. Because nothing in the system, not one mechanism, not one meeting, not one performance cycle ever defined a boundary for enough. The absence of limit becomes its own form of acceleration. Progress without edges becomes velocity. Velocity without resistance becomes identity. That was the shift. I no longer worked hard. I simply moved at corporate speed, which is infinite when unbounded by self. At some point, I noticed my sense of time shift from linear to procedural. Instead of thinking it's Tuesday or it's evening, my mind labeled time by workflow states. Before feedback, after sync, pre-analysis, post-approval. Time stopped being a human container. It became a function of process. The world outside sunlight, seasons, city noises became background textures, like an aesthetic theme applied to the work environment. And here is where the realization became unavoidable. The system did not need to dominate me. It only needed me to stop noticing myself as separate from it. The machine had no villain, no tyrant, no antagonist. The harm was structural, not personal. Diffuse, not directed. Everyone was polite. Everyone was empathetic. Everyone was collaborative. And that's what made it irrevocable. If someone had yelled at me, if someone had demanded more, if someone had applied explicit pressure, I would have resisted. But when the machine offers infinite space for productivity, the human disappears by agreeing. That is the final layer of erosion. There is no reason to stop. The machine never says, enough. So you begin to forget what enough even feels like. Every long-term captivity generates thoughts of escape, even the self-chosen kind. But in this version of captivity, the captivity of high-functioning normalization, the thoughts of leaving don't feel urgent. They feel theoretical, hypothetical, like mental tourism. I began to imagine leaving. Not because I was suffering, but because the idea of escape became a subtle form of entertainment. Sometimes I would picture myself in another job, slower, more grounded, more human. Sometimes I imagined a break, a sabbatical, a pause from acceleration. But these images lacked substance. They were like dreams you can't fully inhabit. The perspective isn't anchored, the objects lack weight, the air has no temperature. I wasn't fantasizing about freedom. I was rehearsing the appearance of agency, a kind of imaginary sovereignty. It felt comforting to know, conceptually, that leaving was possible, even if leaving was never chosen. like keeping a fire exit map in a building you never intend to evacuate. Those were not plans, they were coping mechanisms. The mind wanted the idea of elsewhere, so the body could tolerate the permanence of here. And in every scenario, I imagined I always encountered the same emptiness. This machine wasn't a job anymore. It was my context. It was the operating environment where my emotional language had evolved. I no longer knew who I would be outside of it. Not in dramatic terms, but in practical terms. How do you exit the system? When the system has replaced your sense of self, the machine never needs to restrain you physically. It only needs to convince you that your identity can't survive without its scaffolding. So I didn't leave. I didn't resign. I didn't submit a request or plan a timeline. I simply continued. Not because staying was the only option, but because staying was the path of least existential uncertainty. Leaving would require rediscovering the self, and rediscovering the self would require slowing down long enough to feel the parts of me I had systematically minimized. And that, ironically, would have been more uncomfortable than staying inside a system that never ends. So exit remained fantasy, a simulation, a comfortable thought with no real momentum behind it. It wasn't fear that kept me there. It was lack of an alternative internal identity. At that point, there was nowhere to go, because I had dismantled the version of myself that could inhabit another life. The machine didn't trap me. It simply became my only remaining architecture. It came back exactly the way it began. Small, not like a warning, like a reminder, not a collapse, just a sensation. I was in the 9th floor room again, not for rest, not for escape, but simply because the structure of my day had a blank space that needed to be occupied by something. Not purpose, not meaning, just continuity. And that familiar stillness was there, the one that had framed so many transitions. The water in the small fountain had the same domesticated sound. The city outside moved in its predictable geometry. My phone vibrated in my pocket with the soft suggestion of pending relevance. And I felt myself go still, not with tension, but with a kind of neutral heaviness. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't despair. It wasn't fatigue. It was an awareness, the exact same awareness that had appeared long ago at the beginning, when the first hairline crack had become visible but not yet meaningful. Only this time, there was no innocence left in the observation. I now knew what the crack meant. Not dysfunction, not danger, but inevitability. The crack was not a flaw in the system. It was the shape of it. The evidence that the system only functions by eroding the person into a frictionless shape smooth enough to never resist. This time, I didn't look away from it. I traced it internally, not as a threat, not as a tragedy, but as a fact. Like gravity, like aging, like erosion. A logic, not a crime. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't broken. I wasn't even disappointed. I had become fully fluent in the language of silent depletion. The crack no longer signaled a problem to be fixed. It signaled a pattern to be accepted. This realization, this quiet recognition didn't trigger any dramatic resolution. There was no decision, no declaration, no internal rebellion. Just a small thought, so calm it almost didn't register as thought. This is who I am now. And the moment that thought formed, I felt a deep and terrible calm. The calm of someone who finally stops arguing with gravity. Not surrender, not defeat, just acceptance. I left the room when the calendar told me to. Not because I wanted to, not because I didn't, but because movement had become my default. The crack remained behind me, invisible to everyone else, but no longer invisible to me. I understood now that it had always been there. I had simply needed time to wear down enough to see it clearly. To see myself clearly, not as a person who had been damaged, but as a person who had been integrated. There is no ending here. Not in the traditional sense. No breaking point. No resignation, no dramatic rupture that can be time-stamped and archived. The story didn't accumulate toward collapse. It accumulated toward continuity. I still go to work every day. Not because I'm forced to. Not because I'm afraid not to. Not because I believe in some ideological mission that requires sacrifice. I go because the structure fits. It fits the shape I've become. People sometimes expect stories like this to end in escape, in some cathartic departure, in a reclaiming of self, in a return to some pre-corrupted authenticity. But that expectation assumes the self remains intact throughout. Mine didn't. Not in a tragic way. Not in a dramatic way. Simply in a structural way. I didn't lose myself. I adapted myself until the adaptation became indistinguishable from identity. And when identity changes slowly enough, there is no trauma response. There is only alignment. I still read articles about meaningful work. I still reflect on how systems shape individuals. I still recognize the quiet hum of overfunctioning as a sign of a culture that treats human beings like extensible bandwidth. But those recognitions no longer produce resistance. They produce calm. Not the calm of peace, but the calm of normalization. The crack I saw early on, the subtle fracture that hinted at something fragile beneath the glossy stability, never exploded outward. It simply expanded slowly, then plateaued, then settled into perfect symmetry. Now it's part of the architecture, part of the design, part of me. There is no aftermath, because aftermath implies a change of state. There is only the present tense, living exactly the way it's structured to live. I walk into the building. The lobby exhales its familiar chill. My badge beeps with that same soft, unthreatening confidence. I sit at my desk and work, not with excitement, not with resentment, just with participation. A clean, quiet, frictionless participation. The system never devoured me. It simply used me until I became indistinguishable from the mechanism through which I was used. And in that sense, the story has no ending. It continues every day, in the same calm, controlled cadence that once felt like erosion, and now feels, simply, like life.